Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute legal, financial, or mental health professional advice. Divorce laws, mediation regulations, and psychological standards vary significantly by state and jurisdiction within the United States. Viewers should consult with a licensed attorney, a certified mediator, or a qualified mental health professional regarding their specific circumstances. Please conduct your own due diligence before making any life-altering decisions based on the historical or academic trends discussed in this video. Every year in the United States, approximately 600,000 to 700,000 divorces are finalized. For the vast majority of these individuals, the process is not merely a legal filing. It is a psychological descent into an adversarial system that was originally designed to settle property disputes and contract breaches between 19th-century businessmen. We have inherited a legal architecture that treats the dissolution of a family the same way it treats a multi-car pileup or a broken commercial lease. This fundamental misalignment has created what sociologists call a trauma factory, where the very mechanism meant to provide resolution instead exacerbates the mental health crisis of the American family. In this deep dive masterclass, we are going to pull back the curtain on the intersection of U.S. mental health history and the evolution of divorce mediation. We will explore how we moved from the era of fault-based litigation, where private investigators and public shaming were the norm, to a modern landscape of therapeutic jurisprudence. We will examine why the traditional court system often fails the human psyche, and how a specific shift in 1970s psychological theory gave birth to the mediation industry we see today. If you have ever wondered why the American divorce feels like a battlefield, or if you are looking for a way to navigate a separation without destroying your psychological well-being, this academic breakdown will provide the historical context and the data-driven framework you need to understand the potential outcomes of your own journey. To understand where we are today, we must first look at the grim historical landscape of the early 20th century. Before the 1960s, divorce in the United States was largely governed by the fault system. To obtain a divorce, one spouse had to prove that the other had committed a specific legal wrong, such as adultery, abandonment, or extreme cruelty. This created a perverse incentive structure. In the eyes of the law, there was a winner and a loser, a victim and a villain. This legal framework mirrored the mental health perspectives of the time, which were heavily influenced by early institutional psychiatry and a rigid moral code. Marital discord was often viewed not as a systemic family issue, but as a symptom of individual pathology, particularly in women. Historical records from the early 1900s show that hysteria or nervous collapses were frequently cited in divorce proceedings as both a cause for and a result of marital breakdown. The mental health of the family was secondary to the moral standing of the litigants. The adversarial system essentially weaponized psychological distress, forcing spouses to testify against one another in a public forum, which longitudinal studies now suggest created long-lasting litigation-induced trauma that could persist for decades. The turning point began in the mid-20th century, coinciding with a massive shift in U.S. mental health history, the deinstitutionalization movement, and the rise of humanistic psychology. In the 1950s and 60s, pioneers like Carl Rogers and Virginia Satter began to view the family as a system, rather than a collection of isolated individuals. This was a revolutionary concept. If the family is a system, then the adversarial legal approach is akin to performing surgery on a patient by attacking the very organs you are trying to save. Academic research started to highlight the collinear conflict model, which suggested that the intensity of legal conflict during a divorce was the single greatest predictor of long-term psychological damage to children, outpacing the impact of the separation itself. This data began to trickle into the legal community, leading to the landmark California Family Law Act of 1969, which introduced no-fault divorce. This was the catalyst for the mediation movement. By removing the need to prove a wrong, the law suddenly had a vacuum. If the court wasn't there to judge guilt, what was it there for? Enter the era of divorce mediation. The formal practice began to take shape in the mid-1970s, largely credited to O.J. Kugler, a lawyer who, after his own grueling and expensive divorce, realized that the legal system was fundamentally broken. He founded the Family Mediation Association in 1975, leaning heavily on the integrated model. This model was a hybrid of legal structure and psychological support. Unlike a judge who issues a decree from a bench, a mediator acts as a neutral third party to facilitate communication. This shift represents a move from retributive justice, punishing the past, to restorative justice, planning the future. From an academic perspective, mediation leverages the social exchange theory, which posits that human relationships are formed by the use of a subjective cost-benefit analysis. In a courtroom, the costs are high and the benefits are often pyrrhic. In mediation, the goal is to lower the emotional transaction costs, allowing the parties to retain autonomy over their decisions. Statistical indicators from the last 4 decades suggest that mediation has a profound impact on U.S. mental health outcomes. Studies comparing litigated divorces to mediated ones consistently show that individuals who choose mediation report lower levels of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. One notable study conducted over a 12-year period found that non-residential parents who mediated their divorce remained significantly more involved in their children's lives than those who went through the traditional court system. This is what academics call post-divorce cohesion. The mechanism for this is simple. Mediation requires the parties to practice the very communication skills they will need for the next 20 years of co-parenting. It treats the divorce as a reorganization of the family, not a dissolution of it. However, the history of mediation is not without its critics and complexities. In the 1980s and 90s, feminist legal scholars raised concerns that mediation could disadvantage the less powerful spouse, particularly in cases involving domestic violence or significant power imbalances. This led to the development of screening protocols and the evaluative versus facilitative styles of mediation. This part of our history is crucial because it highlights the necessity of informed consent and the presence of legal safeguards, even within a therapeutic framework. The modern American mediator is now often a dually trained professional or works in a team-based model that includes divorce coaches and financial neutrals. This multidisciplinary approach is the gold standard in contemporary U.S. family law, reflecting a holistic understanding that a divorce is 10% legal, 40% financial, and 50% emotional. As we look at the current state of the U.S. mental health crisis, the role of mediation has never been more relevant. We are currently seeing a move toward online dispute resolution, ODR, and AI-assisted mediation, which aims to further reduce the adversarial heat by removing the physical proximity that can trigger amygdala hijack during negotiations. This historical trajectory, from the moralizing courtrooms of the 1920s to the human-centered, data-driven mediation suites of the 2020s, shows a clear trend toward the medicalization of conflict resolution. We are finally beginning to treat high-conflict divorce as a public health issue, rather than just a private legal matter. By understanding these historical trends and the psychological mechanics at play, the American public can move away from the winner-take-all mentality and toward a model of sustainable separation. In the sections to follow, we will break down the specific stages of the mediation process, the neurobiology of negotiation, and the exact steps used by top-tier U.S. mediators to de-escalate conflict. This is not just about getting through a divorce. It is about the historical and academic effort to preserve the mental integrity of the American family unit in an age of unprecedented social change. We are moving from a history of trauma to a future of strategic transition, and understanding this evolution is the first step in reclaiming your own narrative within the system. We will look at case studies from the 1990s covenant marriage movement and compare them to the collaborative law successes of the 2010s to see exactly which frameworks yield the best psychological potential for all parties involved. This is the deep dive into the architecture of the American heart and law. To truly grasp why the United States legal system is currently undergoing a quiet revolution toward mediation, we have to look at what happens inside the human brain the moment a process server knocks on a door. In the academic world, this is known as the neurobiology of conflict. When an individual like Alex, a software engineer in Austin, Texas, in the year 2026, receives a formal summons for a contested divorce, his brain does not distinguish between a legal document and a physical predator. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function, logical reasoning, and long-term planning, effectively shuts down. Instead, the amygdala takes over, triggering a massive release of cortisol and adrenaline. This biological reality is the primary reason why the traditional adversarial court system often fails to produce healthy mental health outcomes. In a courtroom, every interaction is designed to heighten this stress response. You have a judge on a raised platform, a formal dress code, and an opposing counsel whose job is to highlight your failures. Academics refer to this as a high-threat environment, which is the antithesis of the environment needed for complex decision-making. The historical shift toward mediation was a direct response to this neurological realization. In the early 1980s, U.S. mental health professionals began to document a phenomenon they called litigation-induced post-traumatic stress. They found that for many Americans, the process of going to trial was more damaging than the actual dissolution of the marriage. Imagine if Alex and his spouse, Jordan, decide to pursue the traditional path. They enter what game theorists call the prisoner's dilemma. If Alex hires an aggressive attorney to protect his digital assets and AI-generated intellectual property, Jordan feels she must do the same to defend herself. This creates a feedback loop where both parties spend their savings on legal fees to reach a result that a judge, who knows very little about their personal lives, imposes upon them. This is a zero-sum game. In 2026, with the sheer volume of digital and intangible assets involved in American estates, the complexity of these trials has increased, leading to what sociologists call the backlog of the American soul, where families are stuck in a state of legal and emotional limbo for years. Mediation breaks the prisoner's dilemma by changing the fundamental rules of the game. Instead of a zero-sum framework, it utilizes the principles of integrative negotiation, a concept popularized by the Harvard Negotiation Project in the late 20th century. In this model, the goal is not to divide a pie into smaller and smaller pieces until no one is satisfied, but to expand the pie by looking at interests rather than positions. Let's look at the case of Alex and Jordan more closely. Their position might be that they both want the primary residence. In a 2026 courtroom, a judge might order the house sold and the proceeds split. Both lose their home. In mediation, they explore their interests. Alex might realize his interest is in staying close to his office's hardware lab, while Jordan's interest is in maintaining a stable school district for their children. By identifying these underlying interests, a mediator can help them craft a solution where Alex finds a smaller condo nearby and Jordan stays in the home, perhaps trading a larger portion of the retirement accounts to balance the equity. This is a potential outcome that preserves the mental health of both parties because it reinforces their sense of agency. The historical trend that brought us to this 2026 reality began in earnest with the 1980 publication of the DSM-3. This manual was a turning point in U.S. mental health history because it moved psychiatry toward a more empirical, diagnostic framework. It allowed researchers to more accurately track the specific psychological impact of divorce on the American public. They found that chronic high-conflict divorce was a primary driver of what we now call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. The data was undeniable. The adversarial system was a public health hazard. This led to the rise of the best interests of the child standard, which slowly evolved from a legal catchphrase into a multidisciplinary framework involving psychologists, social workers, and mediators. By the 1990s, many U.S. states began mandating mediation for custody disputes, recognizing that parents who are forced to collaborate are less likely to return to court later. From an academic perspective, mediation functions as a form of social-emotional learning for adults. The step-by-step process of a modern mediation session in 2026 is a masterclass in conflict de-escalation. It begins with the orientation, where the mediator establishes a psychological safety zone. This is followed by the information-gathering phase, where both parties present their data, not as weapons, but as facts for a joint problem-solving exercise. Then comes the most critical phase, the identification of needs. This is where the mental health history of the U.S. intersects with the law. Mediators are trained to listen for the emotional subtext. When a party is arguing over a specific piece of furniture, the mediator recognizes that they are likely grieving the loss of the life they built. By addressing the grief, the legal hurdle often disappears. This is the therapeutic jurisprudence that characterizes the modern era. In the 2020s, we have seen this further evolve into the collaborative divorce movement. This is a step-by-step process where both parties hire specially trained attorneys and a neutral mental health professional to work as a team. If the process fails and they decide to go to court, the entire team must resign, and the parties have to start over with new lawyers. This creates a powerful incentive for cooperation. Case studies from 2024 to 2026 show that this model has a significantly higher rate of long-term settlement durability than traditional litigation. The psychological reason for this is found in the concept of procedural justice. When people feel that the process is fair and that they have been heard, they are much more likely to follow the resulting agreement, even if they didn't get everything they wanted. However, we must also examine the darker side of this history to understand the full picture. For years, the U.S. mental health community and the legal community operated in silos. Lawyers were trained to win, and psychologists were trained to heal. The collision of these two worlds was often messy. In the late 1980s and early 90s, the controversy surrounding parental alienation syndrome showed how psychological theories could be weaponized in courtrooms, often to the detriment of mothers and children. This historical period taught the mediation community a vital lesson. Neutrality is not enough. A mediator must be an active manager of power imbalances. In 2026, modern mediation protocols include sophisticated screening tools for coercive control and domestic abuse, ensuring that the collaborative process is not used as a tool for further victimization. The evolution of divorce mediation in the United States is essentially the story of a nation slowly realizing that its legal tools were too blunt for its emotional problems. We are moving toward a future where the courthouse is the last resort, reserved only for the most intractable or dangerous cases, while the mediation table becomes the standard for the vast majority of American families. But even as mediation becomes the norm, a new and more complex challenge is emerging. In an age of digital lives and AI-integrated families, how do we protect the human element of mediation when algorithms begin to suggest the settlements? And what happens when the shadow of the law, the mere threat of going to court, is no longer enough to bring people to the table? This brings us to a critical junction in our deep dive. To understand the future of American mental health, we have to look at the specific psychological triggers used by the most successful mediators to turn a deadlock into a breakthrough. In the next part, we will explore the secret language of the mediation room and the historical case studies of high-stakes celebrity divorces that change the way the average American views their own legal rights. We will examine the neurolinguistic programming techniques that are now being integrated into state-mandated mediation programs. How do you settle a case when both parties are convinced the other is a monster? The answer lies in a psychological breakthrough that occurred in a small research lab in 1994, and it is the key to everything that follows. The psychological breakthrough in 1994 that fundamentally altered the landscape of U.S. divorce mediation came from the University of Washington, where Dr. John Gottman published his seminal work on marital stability. Through the use of mathematical modeling and longitudinal observation in what was colloquially known as the Love Lab, Gottman was able to predict with over 90% accuracy which couples would eventually divorce based on specific communication patterns. This was the first time in U.S. mental health history that the subjective experience of marital discord was quantified into objective, actionable data. For the burgeoning field of mediation, this was like being handed a map to a minefield. Mediators began to realize that if they could identify what Gottman called the four horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, within the first few minutes of a session, they could tailor their de-escalation strategies to prevent a total psychological collapse of the negotiation. To understand how this looks in practice today, imagine a couple in 2026 named Sarah and David. Sarah is a telehealth consultant and David is a lead developer for a decentralized autonomous organization. They are sitting in a sleek, glass-walled mediation suite in downtown Chicago, or perhaps more likely in 2026, they are in a high-fidelity virtual reality mediation room. They are currently locked in a bitter dispute over the valuation and future governance of a proprietary AI-driven wellness application they co-developed during their marriage. This is what academics call a high-complexity, high-emotion asset. In a 1950s courtroom, David might have tried to prove Sarah's mental instability to gain full control of the asset. In a 1990s courtroom, they would have spent $100,000 on expert witnesses to argue over the valuation. But in 2026, the mediator is watching for the 1994 breakthrough indicators. The moment Sarah says, "David has always been more interested in his code than his family," the mediator identifies criticism. When David rolls his eyes and mutters about Sarah's lack of technical understanding, the mediator identifies contempt, the single greatest predictor of relationship failure, and the most toxic element in a mediation room. Contempt is not just a disagreement. It is a statement of superiority. Historically, the U.S. legal system actually rewarded contemptuous behavior because it made for effective cross-examination. However, the mediation framework of 2026 uses a technique called reframing to neutralize this psychological toxin. The mediator takes Sarah's criticism and David's contempt and strips away the personal attacks. The mediator might say, "What I am hearing is that both of you have a deep investment in the success of this application and are concerned about how your individual roles will evolve post-divorce." This is a move from the blame frame to the problem-solving frame. This shift mirrors a broader trend in U.S. mental health history: the rise of emotional intelligence as a core competency. Following Daniel Goleman's 1995 publication on the subject, the American Bar Association began to integrate social-emotional curriculum into law school programs. We realized that a lawyer who cannot manage their own emotional triggers is a liability in a high-stakes negotiation. In the case of Sarah and David, the mediator uses what is known as tactical empathy. This isn't about being nice. It is a sophisticated cognitive tool used to understand the opponent's perspective so clearly that you can describe it back to them. By doing this, the mediator lowers the cortisol levels in the room. When David feels that his technical contribution is truly understood, his defensive posture softens. This is the neurobiological equivalent of disarming a bomb. Step by step, the mediation process in this 2026 scenario involves a technique called caucusing. When the tension between Sarah and David reaches a tipping point, what academics call the point of diminishing returns, the mediator moves them into separate virtual breakout rooms. In these private sessions, the mediator performs a reality test. They might show David the historical trends of legal costs in contested intellectual property cases from 2023 to 2025, demonstrating that a trial could potentially consume 40% of the asset's total value. This is the application of the sunk cost fallacy in a legal context. Simultaneously, the mediator works with Sarah to explore potential outcomes where she retains a seat on the board of the AI company, while David handles the day-to-day development. By breaking the problem down into smaller, manageable micro-agreements, the mediator builds a momentum of success. The history of this approach is also deeply tied to the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, which forced the mediation community to confront its own limitations. Academics realize that when a power imbalance is too great, or when there is a history of coercive control, the neutrality of mediation can become a weapon. This led to the development of the power and control wheel screening tools used by modern U.S. mediators. In 2026, these tools are often augmented by linguistic analysis software that can detect subtle patterns of intimidation in digital communications. If the software or the mediator flags a significant risk, the mediation is terminated or moved to a shuttle mediation format where the parties never interact directly. This is a critical evolution in U.S. mental health safety protocols, ensuring that the pursuit of a settlement never comes at the cost of an individual's psychological or physical security. As we look at the data, the success of this academic approach is staggering. In jurisdictions that have implemented these psychologically informed mediation programs, such as parts of Florida and California, we see a 60 to 70% reduction in post-judgment litigation. People are not just reaching an agreement, they are reaching an agreement they can actually live with. This is because the mediation process addresses the emotional underlying interests that the law historically ignored. In the academic study of procedural justice, it has been found that the American public values the opportunity to tell their story more than they value the final monetary outcome. The legal system of the past was a gag order. Mediation is a megaphone. But even with these advancements, we are facing a new psychological frontier in 2026. As the American family becomes more fragmented and our lives more integrated with technology, the definition of a fair settlement is shifting. We are seeing cases where individuals like Sarah and David are not just fighting over money or children, but over the digital legacy of their relationship, social media archives, shared cloud storage, and even the rights to their likenesses in virtual spaces. The mental health implications of these digital divorces are only just beginning to be studied. How does the human brain process the loss of a digital life that has been curated for over a decade? This brings us to the next massive shift in our deep dive. While the 1990s were about the individual psyche and the 2000s were about the system, the 2020s are about the intersection of financial trauma and mental health. In the next part, we are going to look at the phenomenon of financial infidelity and how modern mediators handle the psychological fallout of hidden digital assets and crypto wallets. We will explore a case study from 2025 that involved a multi-million-dollar estate, hidden entirely in non-fungible tokens, and the academic framework used to bring both parties back to a place of trust. What happens when the person you trusted most has been leading a secret financial life? The answer involves a psychological technique used by the FBI that has found a surprising new home in the American divorce court. The psychological technique that has revolutionized the 2026 mediation landscape is known as tactical empathy, a concept refined by FBI hostage negotiators and now standard practice in high-stakes American divorce proceedings. When we talk about financial infidelity, we are not just talking about a hidden bank account. We are talking about a fundamental breach of the fiduciary trust that underpins the domestic contract. In the United States, historical trends indicate that financial disagreements are one of the most consistent predictors of divorce, but in the digital age, this has evolved into something far more complex. We are now dealing with what academics call the obfuscation of the digital self. Imagine a character named Marcus, a venture capitalist in San Francisco in the year 2026. For 3 years, Marcus has been diverting a percentage of his bonuses into a series of cold storage crypto wallets and non-fungible tokens representing fractionalized real estate in the metaverse. To his spouse, Elena, these assets are invisible. When the divorce is filed, the discovery of these assets doesn't just create a legal hurdle. It creates an acute psychological trauma that can paralyze the mediation process. This is where the FBI-derived technique of labeling comes into play. In a traditional 1990s legal setting, an attorney would meet Marcus with accusations of fraud, triggering an immediate defensive posture and a subsequent shutdown of communication. In 2026, a sophisticated mediator uses labeling to bypass the amygdala. Instead of asking Marcus why he hid the money, the mediator might say, "Marcus, it seems like there is a significant fear that the traditional legal framework will not recognize the individual risk and effort you put into building these specific digital portfolios." This is not an agreement with his actions. It is a clinical observation of his emotional state. By labeling the fear, the mediator deactivates the threat response. This technique, grounded in the academic study of neurolinguistic programming, allows the party who has been deceptive to feel understood enough to begin the process of disclosure. It moves the conversation from a moral trial to a logistical problem-solving session. The historical context of this shift is rooted in the 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which was a watershed moment for U.S. mental health and financial autonomy. Before this, women in the United States often could not obtain credit in their own names, creating a structural power imbalance that made financial infidelity almost a tool of survival or control. By 2026, that power dynamic has shifted, but the psychological scars of financial control remain embedded in our social fabric. When Elena discovers Marcus's hidden wallets, her brain processes this not just as a loss of money, but as a loss of reality. Academics refer to this as gaslighting-induced cognitive dissonance. The mediator's role is to provide a step-by-step framework for financial forensic discovery that is collaborative rather than adversarial. This involves the use of calibrated questions, another tool from the negotiator's toolkit. Instead of asking David to hand over his keys, the mediator asks, "How can we ensure that the final settlement reflects the total value of the marital estate, so that both parties can move forward with a sense of certainty?" This places the burden of the solution on the person who holds the information. In 2025, a landmark case study in Delaware involved a multi-million-dollar estate where the primary assets were hidden in a series of smart contracts that were programmed to execute only under certain conditions. The traditional court system struggled to even define these assets, let alone value them. The mediation process, however, utilized a neutral financial professional who acted as a digital ombudsman. This professional didn't work for Marcus or Elena. They worked for the integrity of the data. This neutral role is a relatively new development in U.S. mental health history, recognizing that financial transparency is a prerequisite for emotional closure. The potential outcomes of this approach are significantly more stable than those achieved through litigation. When parties like Marcus and Elena reach a settlement through this level of deep, psychologically informed transparency, the likelihood of future litigation drops by nearly 80%. They are not just signing a contract, they are completing a psychological cycle of accountability. We must also consider the scarcity mindset, a psychological phenomenon that frequently derails U.S. mediations. In 2026, with the volatility of the global economy and the shifting nature of work, many Americans enter divorce with a deep-seated fear that there will not be enough to go around. This fear is often exacerbated by the adversarial legal system, which encourages parties to grab as much as possible as quickly as possible. Academics at Harvard and MIT have studied the impact of scarcity on cognitive load, finding that it significantly lowers an individual's IQ and ability to think long-term during a negotiation. A mediator in 2026 counters this by creating a future-focused narrative. They use a technique called the loss leader strategy, where they encourage the parties to make small, low-risk concessions early in the process. This builds a psychological momentum of cooperation. For Marcus and Elena, this might mean agreeing on the distribution of low-value household items or the schedule for their shared digital subscriptions before tackling the complex crypto assets. Furthermore, The integration of financial self-efficacy into the mediation process is a direct result of the 2008 and 2020 economic shifts in the U.S. We realize that many individuals, particularly those who were not the primary breadwinners, leave a marriage with a profound sense of financial helplessness. Modern mediation in 2026 incorporates educational components where the neutral financial professional explains the long-term implications of different settlement options. This is not just legal advice. It is a form of cognitive behavioral coaching. By the time Elena signs the agreement, she doesn't just know what she is getting. She understands how to manage it. This reduces post-divorce anxiety and promotes long-term mental health stability, which is the ultimate goal of therapeutic jurisprudence. As we examine these case studies from the mid-2020s, it becomes clear that the secret to a successful divorce in the modern era is not a better lawyer, but a better understanding of the human ego. Marcus's desire to hide assets was likely rooted in a deep-seated need for autonomy and a fear of being left with nothing, a fear that the traditional court system would have only amplified. By addressing the psychological root, rather than just the legal symptom, mediation provides a pathway that the 19th century architects of our legal system could never have imagined. We are seeing a move toward what some sociologists call the empathic economy of divorce, where the value of a settlement is measured not just in dollars, but in the preservation of the parties' mental well-being and their ability to function as co-parents or independent individuals in the years to follow. But what happens when the conflict isn't just about money? What happens when the primary battlefield is the minds and hearts of children involved? The history of U.S. child custody is a dark corridor of fluctuating theories, from the tender years doctrine to the current push for equal shared parenting. In the next part, we are going to dive into the academic evolution of the parenting plan and how 2026 technology is being used to monitor parental communication in real time to prevent the psychological phenomenon of parental alienation. We will look at a shocking study from 2024 that revealed the true impact of courtroom testimony on the adolescent brain and the new mediation protocols designed to protect the next generation from the fallout of their parents' war. What is the one sentence a parent can say that can either save or destroy their child's psychological future? The answer is more controversial than you think. The sentence that holds this immense power is simple yet devastatingly difficult for a high-conflict parent to utter. You are not responsible for my happiness, and you do not have to choose between us. In the academic study of family dynamics, this is known as the granting of psychological permission. When a child is denied this permission, they enter a state of chronic loyalty conflict, a condition that U.S. mental health history has only recently begun to categorize as a form of emotional maltreatment. To understand the gravity of this, we must look at the historical trajectory of how the United States legal system has viewed children. In the late 19th century, children were legally classified as chattel, or property of the father. By the early 20th century, we shifted to the tender years doctrine, a maternal preference based on the then prevalent psychological theory that young children had a biological imperative to be with their mothers. It wasn't until the 1970s that the best interests of the child standard became the national benchmark, yet even this was criticized for being dangerously subjective, often reflecting the personal biases of a single judge rather than empirical developmental data. Fast forward to the year 2026, and the landscape has shifted toward presumptive 50-50 shared parenting, a move driven by decades of longitudinal research showing that children with meaningful access to both parents exhibit significantly lower rates of substance abuse, depression, and academic failure. However, the 2024 study mentioned earlier, conducted across 3 major U.S. university hospitals, utilized functional MRI technology to observe the brains of adolescents currently involved in high-conflict custody litigation. The findings were a wake-up call for the American Bar Association. Adolescents caught in the middle of adversarial trials showed marked cortical thinning in the prefrontal cortex and an oversized hyperreactive amygdala. Essentially, the stress of being asked to testify or express a preference in court was putting their brains into a permanent state of survival mode, hindering their ability to develop empathy and complex problem-solving skills. Imagine a 14-year-old named Leo living in suburban Seattle in 2026. His parents, Chloe and Ryan, are at the height of a bitter dispute. In a traditional 20th century legal battle, Leo might have been forced into an interview with a guardian ad litem or worse, asked to speak to a judge in chambers. The psychological pressure of knowing that his words could determine where he sleeps and whether one parent feels betrayed is enough to induce what clinicians call a loyalty bind. In 2026, however, Chloe and Ryan are engaged in a mediation process that utilizes a child-inclusive model. In this framework, a child specialist, a neutral mental health professional, meets with Leo separately. This specialist doesn't ask Leo who he wants to live with. Instead, they use projective play or narrative therapy techniques to understand Leo's day-to-day experience. The specialist then brings Leo's voice into the mediation room as a data point, not a decision maker. This protects Leo from the burden of choice while ensuring his needs are the focal point of the negotiation. The step-by-step construction of a 2026 parenting plan is a masterpiece of behavioral economics and psychological safety. It begins with the establishment of a communication protocol. Historical trends show that the majority of post-divorce conflict is triggered by the tone and frequency of digital communication. To combat this, modern mediators often mandate the use of AI-integrated parenting applications. These apps utilize what is known as a semantic firewall. If Ryan tries to send an email to Chloe that contains high-conflict keywords or a condescending tone, the AI pauses the transmission and prompts Ryan to rephrase. It might say, "This message has a high probability of triggering a defensive response. Would you like to focus on the logistical facts of the pickup instead?" By the time the message reaches Chloe, the emotional venom has been neutralized. This creates a low-conflict digital environment that gradually retrains the parents' brains to communicate without hostility. A critical component of this academic look at mediation is the controversy surrounding parental alienation. Historically, this term has been a lightning rod in U.S. courts. In the 1980s, it was often used as a defensive tactic in cases of abuse, leading to a significant backlash from child advocacy groups. However, in 2026, the psychological community has moved toward a more nuanced understanding called child-parent estrangement versus alignment. Academics now distinguish between a child who rightfully rejects a parent due to that parent's own behavior and a child who is being psychologically manipulated to reject a healthy parent. Mediation provides a unique space to address these dynamics before they become entrenched. Through a process called therapeutic mediation, a professional can work with both parents to identify the subtle behaviors, like sighing when the other parent calls or sharing adult legal details with the child, that contribute to the child's withdrawal. By addressing these at the mediation table, families can avoid the potential outcome of a complete and permanent family fracture. The data from 2025 indicates that parenting plans drafted in mediation are 40% more likely to be followed without court intervention compared to those ordered by a judge. The reason is rooted in the psychological principle of ownership. When Ryan and Chloe spend 6 hours debating the minutiae of a holiday schedule, or how to handle Leo's transition to high school, they are building a sense of personal investment in the outcome. They aren't following a judge's order, they are following their own plan. This reduces the urge to rebel against the rules, a phenomenon known in psychology as reactance. Furthermore, mediation allows for the inclusion of right of first refusal clauses and detailed dispute resolution tiers that keep the family out of the courtroom for years to come. As we look at the historical evolution of U.S. mental health, we see that we are finally moving away from the idea that divorce is a single event that ends a family. We are embracing the academic reality that a family is a biological and psychological entity that merely changes form. In 2026, the focus of the American mediator is on the developmental trajectory of the child. They ask questions like, how will this schedule look when Leo is 16 and wants to work a part-time job? Or how can we ensure both parents are present at his graduation without creating an environment of tension? This forward-thinking approach is the ultimate shield against the long-term mental health consequences of divorce. However, even the most perfect parenting plan and the most advanced AI communication tools cannot solve a problem that is currently haunting the American legal system: the rise of the high-conflict personality. There is a specific subset of the population whose brain chemistry actually thrives on the chaos of litigation. These individuals view mediation not as a path to peace, but as a weakness to be exploited. How does the 2026 mediation framework handle a narcissist or a sociopath? What happens when one party is fundamentally incapable of empathy or compromise? In the next part, we are going to explore the clinical profiles of high-conflict litigants and the specialized techniques mediators use to contain them. We will look at the case of the unstoppable petitioner, a 2025 legal battle that lasted 3 years and cost millions, and the specific psychological intervention that finally brought it to a halt. The secret to handling a high-conflict individual isn't logic. It's a technique known as BIF, and it's about to change the way you think about every argument you've ever had. The BIF method, which stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm, was developed by Bill Eddy, a lawyer and therapist who founded the High Conflict Institute. This technique represents a massive paradigm shift in how the U.S. legal system manages what are known as high-conflict personalities or HCPs. Historically, the legal system operated on the assumption that everyone in a courtroom was a rational actor who simply had a disagreement. However, U.S. mental health history shows that a small percentage of the population, estimated at around 10 to 15%, possesses a personality structure that is biologically and psychologically predisposed to perpetual conflict. For these individuals, the resolution is not the goal. The conflict itself is the goal because it provides a sense of power, identity, and an outlet for internal emotional chaos. In the year 2026, we have a name for the specific neurobiological profile of these litigants. They often fall within the cluster B personality spectrum, which includes narcissistic, borderline, and antisocial traits. Imagine a case study from early 2026 involving James and Maria. James is a successful corporate litigator himself, and Maria is a pediatric nurse. For 3 years, James has been the unstoppable petitioner. He has filed 42 separate motions, ranging from disputes over the brand of toothpaste used during Maria's parenting time to complex challenges regarding the valuation of their shared stock options. In a 20th century courtroom, James would have been seen as a zealous advocate for his own interests. But in 2026, a forensic psychological evaluation identifies James as having high conflict traits. His brain chemistry, particularly in the ventral striatum, reacts to a legal victory with a surge of dopamine similar to a drug high. For James, every motion filed is a fix. Maria, conversely, is suffering from what academics call litigation exhaustion syndrome, a form of secondary trauma that has led to chronic insomnia and a 20% decrease in her cognitive processing speed. The BIF technique is the primary tool used by the mediator to break this cycle. The step-by-step application begins with being brief. In 2026, many U.S. jurisdictions have implemented word count limits on party-to-party communications, inspired by the BIF protocol. By keeping responses short, Maria reduces the surface area for James to attack. An HCP like James looks for emotional hooks in a message, words like unfair, hurtful, or disappointed, and uses them as leverage for the next conflict. By staying brief, Maria denies him that leverage. The second step is informative. Maria is trained to provide only the necessary facts. If James sends a 3-page manifesto about her poor parenting, Maria responds with, "The pickup for the holiday will be at 4 p.m. at the library as per the court order." No defense, no explanation, no counteraccusation. In U.S. mental health history, this is known as the gray rock method, a technique used to make one so boring and unresponsive that the high-conflict individual eventually loses interest and seeks their adrenaline fix elsewhere. The third step, friendly, is the most counterintuitive, but academically sound part of the process. It does not mean being overly nice. It means maintaining a neutral, professional tone. This prevents James from successfully claiming that Maria is the aggressor. In 2026, AI-driven sentiment analysis tools are used in mediation to score communications. If Maria's response scores high on the friendly or neutral scale, it becomes much harder for James to justify his next motion for a restraining order or a change in custody. Finally, the response must be firm. This means ending the conversation without leaving an open loop. Instead of saying, "What do you think?" Maria says, "This concludes the logistical arrangements for the weekend." This shuts down the opportunity for a back-and-forth volley of insults. Academic research into the case of the unstoppable petitioner in 2025 showed that when BIF was mandated by the court, the frequency of new filings dropped by 55% within 6 months. The psychological reason for this is found in the concept of extinguishing a behavior. When a behavior no longer produces the desired reward, in this case, an emotional reaction from Maria or a theater-like confrontation in court, the brain eventually stops prompting that behavior. This is a potential outcome that saves the U.S. taxpayer millions in judicial resources and preserves the mental health of families caught in the crossfire. Beyond BIF, the modern mediator in 2026 uses the AR statement: empathy, attention, and respect. This is a targeted intervention designed to calm the HCP's panicked brain. It is based on the clinical understanding that underneath the aggression of a narcissist or a sociopath is often a deep, unacknowledged fear of abandonment or inferiority. By saying, "James, I can see how much work you have put into these financial spreadsheets, and I give you my full attention as we review them," the mediator is providing the respect and attention the HCP craves. This temporarily lowers the person's defenses, creating a brief window where a logical settlement can be discussed. Historical trends in the US show that before these techniques were widespread, high-conflict divorces would frequently end in violence or total financial ruin. Today, these psychological protocols act as a digital and verbal straitjacket, containing the conflict so that it does not destroy everything in its path. However, we must also look at the impact on the legal professionals themselves. In 2026, there is an academic focus on vicarious trauma among mediators and family law attorneys. Dealing with high-conflict personalities day in and day out has led to a mental health crisis within the legal profession. Step-by-step self-care protocols are now integrated into professional licensing requirements. This is a recognition that the legal system is not just a machine of rules, but a human system that is only as healthy as its participants. The 2025 case study of James and Maria eventually ended not with a grand trial, but with a quiet, mediated settlement where James felt he had won a technical victory on a minor point, while Maria secured the long-term stability and peace she needed. This was a masterclass in psychological manipulation for a positive social outcome. But as we move deeper into the mechanics of 2026 mediation, we find ourselves facing an even more pervasive and invisible challenge. It is something that affects even the most reasonable couples, and it is rooted in the very fabric of our modern American economy. It is the psychological impact of the 50-50 time split on the developing brain of a child and the rise of what sociologists are calling the two-home identity crisis. How do children in 2026 handle the constant transition between two different sets of rules, two different digital environments, and two different versions of their own history? In the next part, we will explore the academic research on nomadic childhoods and the new mediation techniques being used to create a unified family culture across two households. We will look at the 2024 longitudinal study on the iPad generation of divorce and the shocking discovery about how virtual transitions are affecting their ability to form deep emotional bonds. Is the 50-50 split actually the gold standard we think it is? Or are we witnessing the birth of a new kind of developmental trauma? The data from 2026 is about to challenge everything we thought we knew about the best interests of the child. The assumption that a 50-50 physical custody split is the absolute gold standard for child development has been the prevailing orthodoxy in the United States for nearly 2 decades. This movement was a direct reaction to the older, more restrictive models that often relegated one parent, statistically the father, to a weekend visitor status. However, as we sit in the year 2026, academic scrutiny is beginning to reveal a more complex and potentially troubling reality, known as the nomadic identity crisis. When we look at the historical trends of U.S. mental health, we see that we have successfully solved the problem of parent-child access, but we may have inadvertently created a new problem of environmental instability. In the academic world, this is referred to as the erosion of the third place. For a child in 2026, their life is often partitioned into two distinct silos that may share the same city, but possess entirely different psychological atmospheres. To understand this, imagine a 10-year-old girl named Zoe living in suburban Atlanta in 2026. Zoe's parents, Marcus and Sarah, followed the advice of their mediators and established a perfectly equal week-on, week-off schedule. On paper, it is a triumph of modern equity. But for Zoe, every Sunday evening is a high-stakes psychological transition. Academically, this is defined as the transitional stress response. In the 2024 National Institute of Child Health and Human Development Continuity Report, researchers utilized wearable biometric sensors to track cortisol levels in children during their transition between homes. The data showed that for many children, the 24 hours surrounding the switch day involve cortisol spikes comparable to the first day of a new school year. The child is not just moving their backpack, they are performing a massive cognitive reset of their social norms, household rules, and even their digital identities. The 2024 study, often referred to as the iPad generation report, revealed a shocking discovery about virtual transitions. In 2026, a child's world is as much digital as it is physical. Zoe has different smart home settings at her father's house than she does at her mother's. She has different screen time filters and different gaming permissions. The study found that this digital fragmentation leads to what psychologists call fractured narrative memory. When a child's environment is constantly shifting, their brain struggles to form a continuous sense of self. They become two different versions of themselves to please two different sets of parental expectations. This is not the same as being a different person at school versus home. This is being two different versions of a daughter in two different domestic architectures. In the mediation room of 2026, the academic response to this is the push for household parity. This is a step-by-step protocol where mediators move beyond the legal schedule and into the granular details of the child's lifestyle. The mediator facilitates a negotiation on what academics call the Unified Domestic Code. For Zoe, this means Marcus and Sarah must agree on more than just bedtimes. They agree on a common digital interface, a consistent nutritional philosophy, and even the same brand of detergent. This sounds like micromanaging, but from a neurobiological perspective, it is a deliberate effort to reduce the cognitive load on the child's developing brain. By making the two homes as similar as possible in their sensory and procedural details, the mediator helps reduce the amplitude of the cortisol spikes during the transition. We must also look at the historical shift in the US from co-parenting to parallel parenting. In the early 2000s, the academic ideal was co-parenting, parents working together like a business partnership. However, for high-conflict families, the data from 2022 to 2025 has shown that forced co-parenting actually increases the child's exposure to conflict. This led to the rise of parallel parenting, a model where parents have zero contact and operate their households as completely independent entities. While this protects the child from witnessing arguments, the 2026 academic critique suggests it exacerbates the nomadic identity crisis because there is no bridge between the two worlds. The child becomes the sole courier of information, a role that induces chronic anxiety. A significant 2025 case study out of the University of Michigan looked at the potential outcomes for children who were given a vote in their transition schedule. The study followed 500 families who used a flexible mediation model where the children, once they reached the age of 12, could choose to extend their stay at one home based on their academic or social needs. The results showed a 30% increase in the child's reported sense of agency and a corresponding decrease in depressive symptoms. This challenges the rigid 50-50 legal framework. It suggests that the best interests of the child might actually be served by a 60-40 or 70-30 split if it provides the child with a primary anchor point during their most volatile developmental years. Step by step, a modern 2026 mediation session handles this by creating a soft landing protocol. Instead of a hurried Sunday night handoff in a grocery store parking lot, a scene that has become a staple of American divorce trauma, the mediator helps parents design a transition that happens through a neutral third party, like a school or an after-school program. This allows the child to decompress from one parent's energy before entering the other's. Furthermore, the mediator introduces the concept of a transition day bag. Not a suitcase of clothes, but a collection of items that stay with the child to provide sensory continuity. This is grounded in the psychological theory of transitional objects, which helps individuals maintain a sense of security when their environment changes. The data from 2026 is clear. The physical split is secondary to the psychological continuity. When we look at US mental health history, we see a cycle of overcorrection. We moved from no access for one parent to forced equal access for both. The next academic frontier is the customization of access. We are entering an era of developmental mediation, where the parenting plan is a living document that must be remediated every 2 to 3 years to match the child's changing neurological needs. A plan that works for a 4-year-old is often psychologically damaging for a 14-year-old. The American public is starting to realize that a permanent court order is a static solution to a dynamic human problem. But as we strive to create these perfect, unified domestic codes and soft landing protocols, we are running into a massive systemic barrier. It is the hidden influence of the state and the underlying financial algorithms that govern child support and alimony. In the United States, the 50-50 split is often pursued not because of developmental psychology, but because it is the threshold that triggers or eliminates specific financial obligations. The mental health of the child is being used as a pawn in a larger game of mathematical formulas and state-mandated fiscal policies. How does the mediation process handle a parent who is fighting for 50-50 custody strictly to avoid a child support payment? What happens when the academic ideal of the child's well-being crashes into the harsh reality of the American tax code and state-funded welfare systems? In the next part, we will peel back the final layer of the divorce industry to reveal the financial architecture of the state. We will explore how child support algorithms in 2026 are influencing parent-child bonds and the controversial case of the automated auditor that changed the way we view the cost of a family. Is the state a silent, invisible partner in your divorce mediation? The answer lies in a series of leaked documents from a 2024 policy summit that will change the way you view every custody battle in the country. The 2024 Policy Summit, often referred to in academic circles as the Summit on Algorithmic Justice, revealed a staggering reality about the United States family law system. The state is not merely a neutral observer of your divorce. It is a primary financial stakeholder with deep-seated institutional incentives that often run counter to the mental health of the family. To understand the 2026 landscape of divorce mediation, we must first analyze the mechanism of Title 4D of the Social Security Act. This federal program provides matching funds to states for the collection of child support. Essentially, for every dollar a state agency collects in child support, the federal government provides a percentage-based incentive payment back to that state. This has created what sociologists call the fiscalization of fatherhood and motherhood, where the state's primary interest becomes the maximization of support orders to maintain state-level administrative budgets. Imagine a character named Liam, a project manager in Columbus, Ohio, in the year 2026. Liam and his spouse, Emma, are attempting to mediate their divorce. Liam wants an exactly equal 50-50 parenting schedule because he believes it is best for their two children's psychological stability. Emma agrees. However, when they enter the mediation room, they are confronted with the state's automated child support calculator. In many U.S. jurisdictions, there is a phenomenon known as the cliff effect. If Liam has the children for 146 nights a year, he may be required to pay several $1,000s a month in support. If he reaches 147 nights, the support order might drop by 30 to 50%. This single night becomes a high-stakes financial battleground. Historically, the U.S. mental health community has warned that night counting is the death of cooperative parenting. When the law attaches a massive price tag to a single sleepover, it transforms a question of developmental psychology into a question of financial survival. The 2024 leaked documents highlighted how state legislatures have historically resisted presumptive 50-50 custody precisely because equal parenting time often leads to a zero-sum child support order. If no money changes hands between parents, the state loses its federal 4D incentive payments. This creates a systemic bias toward the primary custody with visitation model, which academic research has shown is often less beneficial for long-term childhood outcomes than shared parenting. In 2026, the rise of the automated auditor has made this even more transparent. This AI-driven state system scans the digital financial footprints of parents like Liam and Emma in real time. It monitors bank accounts, 1,099K forms from side hustles, and even digital wallet transactions. If Liam's income increases by even 5%, the automated auditor triggers a notification to the state to increase the support order, often without a hearing. This financial surveillance leads to what clinicians call support-induced anxiety, or the financial panopticon effect. For Liam, the knowledge that his financial life is being constantly monitored by a state algorithm creates a level of chronic stress that bleeds into his parenting. He may feel like a visitor in his children's lives, or worse, a simple ATM for the state. Academic studies on paternal engagement in the U.S. show a direct correlation between perceived fairness in the financial settlement and the long-term involvement of the non-residential parent. When the system feels rigged or purely algorithmic, the psychological bond between the parent and the child can suffer. The parent begins to view the child through the lens of a monthly bill, which is a catastrophic outcome for the family's emotional health. Step by step, the modern 2026 mediator must navigate this minefield of state-mandated math. The process begins with a session on financial reality testing. The mediator shows Liam and Emma the state's default calculation, but then moves to an interest-based negotiation on what academics call the actual cost of the child. They break down the child's needs into granular categories: extracurriculars, digital subscriptions, healthcare premiums, and future educational savings. By shifting the focus from the state's arbitrary formula to the child's specific needs, the mediator helps the parents reclaim their agency. This is a move from algorithmic compliance to familial responsibility. In 2026, we are seeing more parents utilize the deviate from guidelines clause in mediation, where they both agree to a number that is different from what the state calculator suggests. This requires a high level of trust and a deep understanding of the legal risks, but it often leads to a much more sustainable and psychologically healthy potential outcome. The historical shift toward these calculators began with the 1984 Child Support Enforcement Amendments and the subsequent Family Support Act of 1988. Before this era, judges had broad discretion to decide what was fair. While this led to some inconsistencies, it allowed for a human touch that the modern system lacks. The 1988 Act mandated that every state implement mathematical guidelines, ostensibly to ensure fairness and speed. However, the academic look at these guidelines shows they were based on economic data from the 1970s that didn't account for the dual-income households and high cost of living in 2026. This has created a gap between the law's math and the family's reality. Furthermore, we must address the psychological impact of imputed income. This is a legal fiction where a court decides that a parent could be earning more than they actually are, and calculates support based on that imaginary number. Imagine Liam decides to quit his high-stress management job to work as a local teacher, so he can be home more with his kids. In a traditional 2026 court proceeding, the state might impute his old salary, effectively punishing him for prioritizing his children's mental health over his own earning potential. The automated auditor would see this as a voluntary reduction in income and maintain the high support order, potentially driving Liam into debt. A mediator's role in this scenario is to facilitate a psychological bridge between the parents. Emma needs to understand that Liam's presence is more valuable to the children than the extra support dollars, and they need to reach a consensus that the state's algorithm would never allow. The data from 2025 shows that when parents are aware of the state's financial incentives, they are actually more likely to settle in mediation. They realize that if they fight in court, they are essentially feeding a machine that cares very little for their personal well-being. This is the birth of the strategic settlement. Parents are opting to keep their financial details private and their agreements out of the state's automated systems as much as legally possible. This is a form of digital and financial autonomy that is becoming a cornerstone of the American divorce experience in the late 2020s. However, even as we tackle the state's financial influence, a new and perhaps even more personal challenge is arising in the mediation rooms of the United States. It involves the very definition of what constitutes a family in 2026. We are seeing an explosion in multi-parent households, polyamorous dissolutions, and the rights of non-biological genetic contributors. How does the mediation process handle the mental health of a child when there are 3 or 4 parental figures involved, each with their own legal and emotional claims? In the next part, we will explore the academic evolution of the expanded family and the new mediation protocols for non-traditional households. We will look at a 2025 case study from New York that involved a 5-party custody dispute and the psychological framework used to maintain stability for the children. We will also examine the rise of the pet custody battle and how 2026 technology is being used to determine the best interests of non-human family members. What happens when the law has no box to put your family in? The answer is found in a radical new theory of relational equity that is currently shaking the foundations of the American legal system. The definition of a family is changing, and the mediation room is the first place where the new rules are being written. The conceptual collapse of the traditional nuclear family model has reached a fever pitch in the American mediation suites of 2026. For nearly a century, U.S. family law was built upon a binary foundation: 2 parents, usually of opposite sexes, and their biological offspring. This structure was the bedrock of U.S. mental health history, with early 20th century psychologists like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth focusing almost exclusively on the mother-child dyad. However, as we navigate the post-pandemic social landscape of the mid-2020s, that binary foundation has fractured. We are now entering the era of the expanded family, a phenomenon where the legal system is forced to recognize that the psychological health of a child is often distributed across a network of 3, 4, or even 5 parental figures. In the academic world, this has led to the rise of relational equity, a theory suggesting that legal rights should follow the functional reality of who is actually doing the parenting, rather than just whose name is on the birth certificate. Imagine a case study from late 2025 in New York, a jurisdiction that has been at the forefront of this shift. We have a character named Taylor, who is part of a polyamorous triad that includes Jordan and Casey. For 6 years, they have raised 2 children together in a single household. When the relationship between Taylor and the others dissolves in 2026, the traditional legal system is paralyzed. In 1990, Taylor would have been a legal stranger to the children if they were not the biological parent. But in the 2026 mediation room, the mediator utilizes the functional parent doctrine. This academic framework looks at a step-by-step checklist of behavioral history. Did Taylor provide daily care? Was Taylor responsible for medical and educational decisions? Did the children view Taylor as a primary source of emotional security? If the answer is yes, Taylor is granted standing. The mediation process then involves creating a 5-party parenting plan that includes not just Taylor, Jordan, and Casey, but also the children's long-term step-parents or live-in partners, Morgan and Riley. This logistical complexity is a nightmare for a traditional judge, but it is exactly what mediation was designed for. The mediator facilitates what academics call a network-based negotiation. Instead of the two-sided table, we have a circular dialogue. The potential outcomes of these sessions are radical. In the 2025 New York case, the parties didn't just settle on a schedule. They drafted a family constitution. This document outlined a hierarchy of decision-making power, a shared digital calendar accessible by all 5 adults, and a collective financial pool for the children's future. From a mental health perspective, this is a massive win. Historically, when a non-biological parent was cut out of a child's life after a breakup, it resulted in a type of disenfranchised grief that could lead to lifelong attachment disorders for the child. The 2026 mediation model prevents this by acknowledging that the child's heart doesn't care about DNA. It cares about consistency. This brings us to the controversial role of genetic contributors in 2026. With the proliferation of at-home DNA testing and the shift toward open identity sperm and egg donation, the line between donor and parent has blurred. We are seeing a historical trend where donors are seeking, and sometimes winning, visitation rights under the theory of the psychological parent. In a 2026 mediation, a mediator might handle a case where a biological donor has been a social uncle to the child for a decade. When the social parents divorce, the donor may step in to provide stability. The academic challenge here is balancing the rights of the legal parents with the existing emotional bonds of the child. The step-by-step mediation involves a process of role definition. The mediator helps the parties distinguish between a primary caregiver and an auxiliary support figure. This prevents the child from being overwhelmed by too many authority figures, while preserving the valuable relationships that contribute to their resilience. But the definition of family in 2026 doesn't stop at humans. We are currently witnessing the rise of the pet custody battle as a primary driver of high-conflict mediation. Historically, under U.S. law, a dog or a cat was treated as a piece of property, no different from a toaster or a sofa. However, U.S. mental health history has long recognized the profound therapeutic bond between humans and their pets. In 2026, several U.S. states have adopted sentient property laws, which require courts to consider the well-being of the animal. Imagine a character named Sam who is mediating a divorce in California. Sam and their spouse are at a total impasse over their golden retriever Buddy. In 2026, the mediator doesn't just ask who paid for the dog. They utilize AI-driven pet monitoring data. They look at wearable technology that tracks Buddy's heart rate, sleep patterns, and activity levels when he is with Sam versus when he is with the other spouse. This objective data on the dog's stress levels is brought into the mediation as a way to determine the best interests of the pet. The potential outcomes of pet mediation in 2026 often mirror child custody plans. We see nesting agreements where the dog stays in the family home, and the humans rotate in and out. We see shared expense agreements for veterinary care and premium pet longevity treatments. Academics refer to this as the multi-species family model. The psychological impact on the humans is significant. For many Americans, the loss of a pet during a divorce is a secondary trauma that can derail the entire legal settlement. By treating the pet with the same level of care as a child, the mediator validates the parties' emotional reality, which lowers the overall temperature of the negotiation. At the core of all these new family structures is the theory of relational equity. It is the idea that we are moving away from a system of status, who you are biologically, to a system of contract, what you do emotionally. This is a terrifying shift for some, as it challenges the traditional sanctity of the nuclear family. But for the U.S. mental health community, it is a long overdue recognition of the diversity of American life. The 2026 mediator is essentially an architect of these new social contracts. They are building bridges where the law used to build walls. They are using psychological protocols to ensure that as the American family expands, it does not shatter. However, as we look at these complex, multi-party, multi-species agreements, a final and deeply personal question remains. Who is the person sitting in the middle of all this chaos? The mediator themselves is a human being operating in a high-pressure environment of concentrated human misery. In the final part of our deep dive, we are going to look at the secret psychology of the mediator. We will explore the academic research on neutral fatigue and the controversial use of biofeedback technology to monitor a mediator's own emotional regulation during a session. What happens when the person meant to be the calm center of the storm starts to sink? We will look at the final frontier of the U.S. divorce industry, the total integration of AI and human empathy, Is the future of divorce a human mediator at all, or are we moving toward a world of algorithmic peace? The answer is the final piece of the puzzle in our look at the architecture of the American heart and law. The persona of the mediator is often portrayed as a serene, unflappable presence, but the academic reality of the third side in 2026 reveals a much more taxing psychological burden. In U.S. mental health history, the professional well-being of the mediator was largely ignored until the great burnout of the early 2020s, which saw a 35% attrition rate among family law professionals. This led to a profound realization. Neutrality is not a passive state of being, but a high-calorie cognitive task that requires constant emotional regulation. Academics call this active neutrality. When a mediator sits between two individuals like Claire and Ethan, who are navigating a high-conflict separation in 2026, they are not just facilitating a conversation. They are acting as a biological heat sink for the collective trauma in the room. Imagine a mediator named Julian working in a high-density urban center, like Philadelphia in 2026. Julian is conducting a session where Ethan is experiencing an acute episode of what sociologists call status threat anxiety. Ethan has just learned that the mediation agreement might require him to liquidate a legacy family property to satisfy Claire's equitable share of their shared digital venture. As Ethan's voice rises and his body language becomes aggressive, Julian's own nervous system begins to mirror that stress. This is known as somatic empathy, a process where the mediator's body physically reacts to the conflict of others. In 20th century practice, Julian would have been expected to simply suppress this. But in 2026, Julian wears a discrete biofeedback haptic band. When his heart rate variability drops below a certain threshold, a historical trend in detecting early-stage stress, the band emits a gentle, rhythmic pulse. This is the integration of technology and mindfulness, allowing Julian to engage in co-regulation. By calming his own nervous system, he biologically signals to Ethan and Claire that the environment remains safe, effectively lowering the cortisol levels of everyone in the room. This technological intervention is a direct response to the academic study of vicarious trauma. Data from 2024 to 2026 suggests that mediators who utilize biofeedback and structured debriefing protocols are 50% more likely to reach a settlement in high-conflict cases. This is because a regulated mediator can maintain what is called the cognitive empathy window. If the mediator becomes overwhelmed, they lose the ability to perform the complex mental modeling required to find creative solutions to asset division. The mediator's mental health is, quite literally, the fuel for the settlement engine. However, as we push further into 2026, we find ourselves at the center of the most significant debate in the history of U.S. dispute resolution: the rise of the algorithmic mediator. Following the success of automated small claims systems in the early 2020s, several tech-forward U.S. jurisdictions have begun piloting fully autonomous AI mediation platforms for divorce. These systems use massive datasets of historical court rulings, psychological profiles, and financial trends to propose settlements. For a couple like Claire and Ethan, the potential outcome of using an AI mediator is an agreement reached in minutes rather than months, at a fraction of the cost. The AI is immune to neutral fatigue. It does not get tired, it does not have personal biases, and it cannot be intimidated by Ethan's aggression. But the academic critique of algorithmic peace is rooted in what is known as the empathy gap. A 2025 study from the MIT Media Lab found that while AI could solve the mathematical puzzles of alimony and child support with 99% accuracy, it failed miserably at addressing the underlying psychological needs of the parties. When Claire cried during the session, expressing a deep-seated fear that the divorce was a personal failure, the AI lacked the capability to provide the emotional validation that historical trends show is necessary for long-term settlement durability. Without that human connection, Claire felt processed rather than heard. This led to a phenomenon called settlement remorse, where parties who reached an agreement via AI were 40% more likely to attempt to vacate that agreement within the first year. This has led to the 2026 gold standard, the augmented human model. In this step-by-step process, the AI handles the heavy lifting of data analysis, financial forensic discovery, and the initial drafting of the parenting plan based on standard developmental benchmarks. This frees the human mediator to focus entirely on the emotional and psychological architecture of the deal. Julian doesn't have to spend 3 hours calculating the tax implications of a stock transfer. He can spend those 3 hours helping Ethan process the grief of losing the family home. This is the synthesis of history, law, and mental health. We have moved from a 19th century system that ignored emotions, through a 20th century system that pathologized them, to a 21st century system that integrates them into the very fabric of the legal process. The historical trajectory we have traced in this deep dive, from fault-based litigation and the psychiatric institutions of the 1920s to the neurolinguistic programming and bio-integrated mediation of 2026, shows a clear and undeniable trend. The American public is no longer willing to accept a legal system that destroys the family in order to save the assets. We are seeing a move toward what academics call the therapeutic state, where the goal of every legal intervention is to leave the participants more psychologically resilient than they were before. Case studies of successful 2026 mediations show that the true value of the process isn't just the signed document at the end. It is the transformation of the parties from adversaries into business partners in the ongoing venture of their family. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we must recognize that we are still in the early stages of this revolution. The architecture of the American heart and law is still being rewritten. The move toward 50-50 shared parenting, the recognition of multi-parent households, the protection of the adolescent brain from litigation trauma, and the containment of high-conflict personalities are all components of a larger effort to modernize the human experience of separation. We have provided you with the historical context, the academic data, and the step-by-step frameworks that define the modern era of divorce mediation. Whether you are a professional in the field, a student of U.S. history, or an individual navigating your own journey, understanding these trends is the key to navigating the potential outcomes of the future. But even as we master the mechanics of the mediated settlement, a new and even more profound question is beginning to emerge in the academic journals of 2026. If we can use these psychological and technological tools to successfully de-escalate the end of a marriage, can we use them to prevent the breakdown in the first place? Is the future of mediation not in the divorce court, but in the preemptive maintenance of the American relationship? In our next series, we will transition from the dissolution of the family to the future of marital longevity. We will explore the rise of the pre-parenting agreement, the use of AI-driven relationship coaching, and the controversial 2026 movement toward the 5-year renewable marriage contract. What happens when we apply the science of mediation to the beginning of the story instead of just the end? The data is already coming in, and it promises to be even more disruptive than everything we have discussed so far. This concludes our deep dive into the history and future of U.S. divorce mediation, but the conversation on the evolution of the American family is only just beginning.